Over the last few decades, the countries that make up Central Asia have not been okay. For over 30 years, this has been one of the most dangerous, complicated, and broken border regions on the planet. But that history is, well, history. In March 2025, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan signed a historic treaty that did the impossible. They fixed the map. Today, we're going to find out how these three countries finally untangled the world's biggest not-like border. And it all starts with their combined physical geography. Let's start with the sheer scale of the region. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are within the general area we call the roof of the world. They're dominated by two massive mountain ranges, the Tian Shan and the Pamirs respectively. These are peaks that top 7,000 meters, which also means that these two countries are Central Asia's water towers. Their geography is defined by rock, ice, and narrow winding valleys that trap communities in isolation. In fact, 93% of Tajikistan is mountainous, and Kyrgyzstan isn't far behind. For them, flat land is the most precious resource they have. Then you have Uzbekistan. While its eastern neighbors are scraping the sky, Uzbekistan is pretty flat. It sits downstream, waiting for the water that melts off those Kyrgyz and Tajik glaciers. But because it's flat, Uzbekistan holds the majority of the region's arable land and population centers. This means that it's geographically vulnerable because it relies entirely on water that originates outside its borders. And this is where the geography gets tricky. It's the feature that binds them all together, the Fergana Valley. If there's a geographic feature in this story that has big main character energy, it's the Fergana Valley. Picture a massive, fertile bowl shaped like an almond, about 300 kilometers long. It's an oasis of incredible agricultural productivity, surrounded by foreboding mountain ranges on all sides. Geographically, it's a single coherent unit, a closed system. Rivers flow into it, the crops grow in it, and the people, well, live and farm in it. But here's the issue. The entrance to this valley is narrow, controlled largely by Tajikistan. The high ground surrounding it belongs mostly to Kyrgyzstan, and the lush, flat bottom where the food is grown, that belongs mostly to Uzbekistan. This creates a nightmare for logistics. For a long time, if you were a truck driver trying to get from one part of Uzbekistan to another, you might have to cross a mountain range and drive through another country just to stay on flat ground. If you were a Kyrgyz herder, your winter pastures might be separated from your summer pastures by a Tajik village that sits squarely in the middle of the only traversable valley. The geography here ignores the political lines on the map. The Sirdarya River doesn't care about sovereignty. It just flows downhill from the Kyrgyz mountains to the Uzbek cotton fields. The mountains don't care about treaties. They create natural corridors that force people into each other's spaces regardless of their passport. This physical reality is what makes this region unique. In many ways, it's a hydrologic civilization, where the upstream countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, have the water but little land, and the downstream country, Uzbekistan, has the land but needs the water, which means they're locked in a geographic hug that no one can fully untangle from. Now, for decades, we looked at this map and it was a mess. There are enclaves inside of enclaves, roads that cross borders 4 times in 10 miles, and villages split down the middle. This was just how it was, a permanent geographic disaster zone. But the physical landscape didn't change in March 2025. The mountains didn't move, the rivers didn't reroute. Instead, the historic borders that were originally drawn up were finally, after decades of confusion, beginning to get smoothed out. To understand why the 2025 Kyrgyzstan Treaty is such a miracle, we have to look up the mess it cleaned up. And to do that, we need to travel back to a time when borders in Central Asia were more like suggestions rather than lines in the sand. It took decades to finally untangle that geographic disaster zone. And honestly, trying to navigate the healthcare system often feels like a similar disaster zone. A tangled mess of phone calls and waitlists that leave you feeling stuck. Which is why I'm so excited about today's sponsor, ZocDoc. I'll be honest, I've been putting off a checkup recently for an old shoulder injury. It's not because I don't want to be healthy, it's because I dread the process. I hate calling offices, getting put on hold, and worrying that when I finally do get an appointment, the doctor won't even really listen to me. Which is why, as part of my New Year's resolution, I'm determined to get this sorted out. This will mean doctor's visits, checkups, and of course, physical therapy. But with ZocDoc, I'm not worried about the process of it at all. ZocDoc is a free website and app where you can find and book high-quality in-network doctors. They have over 150,000 providers across all 50 states covering 200 specialties. Because of ZocDoc, I expect the booking, visit, and follow-up to be stress-free. I'll use the verified patient reviews to find a provider who will make me feel heard and help me get the care that I need. And I won't have to wait months. I can see their real-time availability and typically book an appointment within just 24 to 72 hours, sometimes even the same day. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to www.zocdoc.com/gbg. Also linked in the description to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. So check the link below to find a professional who actually listens. Trust me, it makes a huge difference to find a provider who treats you like an individual. But historically, in this region of Central Asia, people weren't defined by their individual nationality, but rather by how they lived their own lives. For centuries, if you lived in the Fergana Valley, your identity wasn't defined by a national flag. You were defined by your lifestyle. You were either a settled city dweller who farmed and traded, or you were a nomad who roamed the mountains with your herds. Uzbek and Tajik were linguistic distinctions, sure, but they weren't passports. A Tajik-speaking merchant in Bukhara had more in common with an Uzbek-speaking merchant in Kokand than he did with a nomad living in the Pamirs Mountains, deep in the southeastern part of modern-day Tajikistan. Then came the Russian Empire in the 19th century, painting the whole region in one broad color, Turkestan. But with the arrival of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, the region was chopped up many times over. This was due to a single man, infamous throughout history, Joseph Stalin. Now, there's a popular internet myth that Stalin sat down with a bottle of vodka and a red pencil, deliberately drawing crazy squiggly lines to make sure these future countries would hate each other forever, a strategy called divide and rule. The reality is actually more complicated, and in some ways worse. The Soviet planners weren't trying to create chaos, they were trying to apply strict European logic to a non-European reality. They wanted to create national republics, one for the Uzbeks, one for the Kyrgyz, and one for the Tajiks. They sent ethnographers into the valley to count people, asking things like, "What language do you speak?" This is a very European mindset because Europeans largely, over centuries of conflict, self-divided over linguistic and cultural lines. The problem was that the valley floor was a mix of farming towns, mostly Uzbek and Tajik, while the surrounding hills were full of nomads, Kyrgyz. But you can't build a functional country that only consists of mountain peaks, and you can't build a farming country without water sources. So, the Soviets tried to balance two impossible things: ethnicity and economics. They gave the fertile valley floor mostly to Uzbekistan because that's where the Uzbek farming population was. But to give the new Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan a fighting chance in an economy, they had to grant them access to the lowlands and the rivers. This forced the mapmakers to draw long, spindly fingers of land reaching into the valley, trying to connect the Kyrgyz mountain village to a Kyrgyz market town on the plain. This is where the infamous enclaves were born, those little islands of one country floating inside another. Places like Sok, Baruk, and Shakimardan. But it's worth noting that these weren't necessarily drawn as islands initially. In the 1930s and 50s, the borders were basically internal administrative lines, like the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania. It didn't matter if a road crossed the Soviet Republic of Uzbek into the Soviet Republic of Kyrgyz because it was all Soviet. Often, these enclaves formed through informal land swaps. A Kyrgyz collective farm might say to a Tajik farm, "Hey, we need more grazing land for our sheep in the winter. You can have this patch of valley floor for your cotton." They'd swap the land to make the economy work, and the local Soviet bureaucrats would rubber stamp it. But the official maps in Moscow weren't always updated to reflect these handshake deals. Baruk is the classic example. Historically, it was a Tajik settlement, but as the Kyrgyz population around it grew and settled down, Baruk became surrounded. On a Soviet map, it was just a dot. It wasn't until later that people realized, wait, to leave my village, I have to drive through foreign territory? Then, the catastrophe for the region happened. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, those invisible administrative lines became hard international borders. Suddenly, that handshake deal grazing land wasn't just a farm, it was a sovereign territory of the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. This meant that the infrastructure of the entire region broke down. The Soviet Union built power lines, canals, and roads as a single integrated system. But now that system was sliced up by three different governments, each with their own advantage. Uzbekistan had the food, Kyrgyzstan had the water, and Tajikistan had the entrance to the valley, and they stopped sharing. For 30 years, this created a slow-motion humanitarian disaster. Villagers in the enclaves were effectively trapped. If Uzbekistan had a dispute with Kyrgyzstan, they would simply close the border, starving the enclaves of food and medicine. And these tensions didn't stay political either. They got violent. As populations grew, water became scarce. In April 2021, and again in September 2022, the region exploded. What started as a dispute over a surveillance camera at a water intake station spiraled into full-blown artillery battles between Kyrgyz and Tajik militaries. Tanks rolled through villages that had coexisted for centuries. Hundreds of people died. It looked like the divide and rule prophecy had finally come true. The map was so broken that it seemed the only way to fix it was war. But hitting rock bottom sometimes forces a breakthrough. The violence of 2022 shocked the leaders of all three countries. They realized that if they didn't fix the lines on the map, specifically the nightmares of Varuk and the water rights, they were going to drag their countries into a perpetual state of war that none of them could afford. This brings us to March 2025. After decades of shooting, arguing, and stalemates, the leaders met in the ancient city of Kyrgyzstan to do the impossible: fix Central Asia's most complicated borders. On March 31st, 2025, the presidents of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan met in a city that had seen empires rise and fall for 2,000 years, Kyrgyzstan in Tajikistan. They signed two documents: the final delimitation of the Tri-Junction Point, where all three borders meet, and the Kyrgyzstan Declaration of Eternal Friendship. Now, eternal friendship sounds like standard diplomatic fluff, but the actual treaty details attached to it were revolutionary. They didn't just tweak the border, they fundamentally changed how these countries interact. The biggest hurdle had always been Varuk, that Tajik enclave inside Kyrgyzstan. For decades, Tajikistan insisted that it wasn't an enclave, but a peninsula connected to the mainland. Kyrgyzstan, however, insisted it was basically an island. And so the treaty began with a painful but necessary trade. Kyrgyzstan agreed to transfer the village of Dostuk, a tiny settlement that had effectively blocked the road to Varuk, to Tajikistan. In exchange, Tajikistan ceded an equivalent amount of land, about 190 hectares, in the Razakov areas to Kyrgyzstan. But the real genius was the infrastructure. Instead of just swapping land, they agreed to build a neutral status corridor. This is a new road connecting the Varuk enclave to mainland Tajikistan. It's technically sovereign Kyrgyz soil, but it's managed jointly, allowing Tajiks to drive to their enclave without passing through Kyrgyz border control, and allowing Kyrgyz villagers to cross it without being stopped. Also, remember the Golovnoy water intake? The specific facility that started the 2021 Tajikistan-Kyrgyzstan conflict? Probably not, because the story of this conflict wasn't really covered in Western media. But the treaty applied a solution so simple it's almost embarrassing that people died over it. They split it down the middle. The treaty mandates a strictly monitored 50-50 split of the water flow. The facility is now jointly staffed with Kyrgyz and Tajik engineers standing next to each other, watching the same gauges. They even physically divided the mechanical hatches. Kyrgyzstan controls 1.5 hatches, and Tajikistan controls 1.5 hatches. And to ensure no one cheats, they installed digital flow meters that stream real-time data to both Bishkek and Dushanbe. If the water levels drop, everyone knows instantly. While Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were doing the heavy lifting of land swaps, Uzbekistan's president was there to lock in the final piece of the puzzle, the Tri-Junction Point. This is the exact spot in the Fergana Valley where all three countries meet. For years, it was a no-man's land of drug smuggling and illegal crossings because no one could agree on who owned which bush. The Kyrgyzstan Treaty fixed this point geographically and marked it with a new friendship memorial. But more importantly, Uzbekistan used its economic leverage to grease the wheels. Tashkent, the largest and most populous city in Central Asia, agreed to open its massive markets to goods from the remote Kyrgyz and Tajik border towns, effectively turning these dead-end conflict zones into new trade hubs. What exactly does the map look like today? Visually, it only looks a little cleaner. The islands are still there, but they're no longer trapped. The borders are better defined, and most importantly, the barbed wire is coming down in favor of digital surveillance and open checkpoints. But the biggest change is psychological. For the first time in 100 years, a farmer in Batken, Kyrgyzstan doesn't wake up worrying if his cow is going to cause an international incident. A driver in Isfara, Tajikistan doesn't have to pay a bribe to cross a border. The Kyrgyzstan Treaty didn't change the mountains, and the geography of the Fergana Valley is still a complicated knot. But by accepting that they couldn't defeat the geography, these three countries finally decided to work with it. They proved that even the most broken borders on Earth can be fixed, if you're willing to trade a little bit of land for a whole lot of peace. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan have set the standard for solving international border disputes. But this doesn't mean everything will go smoothly. There's bound to be hiccups and issues along the way. Still, as of 2026, we can say that this has been a monumental step forward for peace in the region. This week I'm in Spain, but I'm also still in Africa? That's right, I'm heading to Spain's tiny African exclave of Ceuta to figure out why Spain has their very own Gibraltar connected to Morocco. I hope you enjoyed learning all about Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. If you did, be sure to check out this video on why New Jersey is more than just a giant suburb. Thanks for watching. See you next time.